Good evening. I'm Eric Smith, and on behalf of the Cultural and Fine Arts Committee, I would like to welcome you to the 2022 Humanities Teacher of the Year program. We are so glad that you could join us tonight as we recognized this year's honoree. The humanities are a broad field and they encompass a wide range of academic disciplines, but those disciplines are united by a general focus on us, on humans and the social and cultural characteristics that shape our world and our experiences of it. Every year, the faculty and staff and administrators at Northeast, along with the Mississippi Humanities Council, co-sponsor an outstanding faculty member in the humanities. This outstanding instructor is honored on campus, where they give a presentation highlighting their work. They are also invited to attend a state honors banquet in Jackson, recognizing all the honorees for that year. Tonight, I'm happy to present this year's winner of the Humanities Teacher of the Year Award, Instructor of History and Political Science, Will Bowlin. But before his presentation, I would like to invite our representative from the Mississippi Humanities Council, Carla Faulkner, up to say a few words.
The Mississippi Humanities Council is pleased to honor Will Bowlin for his outstanding teaching here at Northeast Mississippi Community College. Every year, we recognize a Humanities Teacher Award winner at each of our state's colleges and universities. The awardee is asked to present a lecture on a humanities-related subject of their choice, like you'll hear tonight. They receive a cash award and will be publicly recognized for their achievements at our awards gala in Jackson on March 25th. This year, the MHC is turning 50, and we are spotlighting public programs that focus on topics that reflect Mississippi and their stories. Since our founding in 1972, we have recognized that Mississippi scholars and teachers like Mr. Bowlin show the importance of the humanities in creating engaged and informed citizens. At the Mississippi Humanities Council, our motto is, "The humanities are for everyone." And that is true for you as students at Northeast. It is true for the program that I work with, where we sponsor Northeast to teach courses to students who are incarcerated, and it's true for everyone else in the state. The Council is an independent nonprofit organization supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and also by grants and donations from private foundations, corporations, and individuals. The Council, in turn, supports and develops a wide range of programs across Mississippi that help us explore our rich history and culture. We create opportunities for Mississippians to learn about themselves and the larger world, and enrich communities through civil conversations about our history and our culture. The Council is thrilled that one of these programs, the Smithsonian Museum on Main Street, will be here at Northeast June 18 to August 16. This exhibit, called Voices and Votes, looks at our role in making our democracy work. Not surprisingly, the person responsible for bringing this timely exhibit to Northeast is Mr. Will Bowlin. We do invite all of you to join us in this work. Please visit our website, mshumanities.org, or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram to learn more about us and our programs. Thank you very much.
So is it raining outside yet? Not yet. As soon as we get out, that's when the bottom will fall out. All right, let me get situated here. I appreciate everybody coming out, fighting potential weather when we leave, fighting construction projects or crossing the road safely or whatever. I recognize some current students, some former students, a former boss or supervisor, current supervisor, some loud kids in the back. So if I have to stop and interrupt, I may have to take some kids outside and straighten them out or whatever. So I want to thank Mr. Smith and Ms. Faulkner, my former division head, and the Mississippi Humanities Council for sponsoring tonight's presentation and event and the check that's coming in the mail. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight is how the message related to historical events, how that can help, obviously, affect or shape our perceptions and how we think about what has happened in the past, how it has shaped what we've become as a society, as individuals, as groups of individuals. But Mr. Smith has already covered, in his introduction, he already covered basically a baseline definition of what humanities are. But I'm going to cover mine as well. So I was trying to find, you can Google a definition of anything, right? There's several different variations of definitions for humanities and what humanities are based around. I was trying to find one specific or more applicable to historic application. And so on the website, the division website at the University of Rhode Island, the first bullet point defines humanities as the stories, ideas, and words that help us understand our lives and our world. I include, without reading that second bullet point, there's a key word in there that could also or should maybe be inserted, relevant to my presentation, that should be inserted into that definition, the approach. How you talk about something or how you teach something can shape the stories of how we understand our lives and where we come from. So I wanted to at least have that understanding on the front end. What I'm going to talk about in this, y'all going to hear me say a lot of the same common words: controversy, commemoration, contention. A lot of those, I think all those start with C. Y'all going to hear me say that a lot, those words. But I'm going to use 4 examples. One of these, actually, only one of these is what I talk about every semester in a U.S. History 1 class. The rest of it is kind of new material for me to vocalize and talk about, so let's hope for the best on that. And so from a historical perspective, from educational classroom perspectives, and how we commemorate even the end of World War II, we're going to talk about how there are different angles that you can view those stories and how or what lens or angle you look through at that event, how it can form or influence the way you think about it based on your perceptions or your opinions. And we'll fit in politics. Go figure, politics will sometimes seep its way into controversial topics or ideas. So, like literally this week and last week, depending on what class you're in my U.S. History 1, we did talk about this in my sections. The Boston Massacre happened in March of 1770, all right? In my classroom, I refer to the Boston Massacre as just another puzzle piece in the road to the revolution. Y'all have heard me say that if you've had my class before. The road to revolution unit or lecture. So what the Boston Massacre happened, what occurred or what led to the Boston Massacre, this was a result, almost the epitome or the result of 17 ongoing months of British military occupation, right? Whether you want to think of that as martial law or whatever. After the French and Indian War, Boston and Massachusetts started to acquire a reputation for bowing up to their government, right? If that's the way you want to simplify that down. So in response to maintain order, the British government continued to send redcoats and professional soldiers in that area to maintain order. Bostonians and residents did not like that, right? They didn't like that idea of old school military law, right? Martial law. And so in March, you had this firefight. You had this event happen that we've all heard of before, and on March 5th, there were 3 casualties and 3 deaths. 2 more died, 2 more passed away either the day, I know one passed away, died the day after, it may have been the day after that where you had the 5th death, all right? So initially, this was labeled by the Boston residents as a bloody massacre, right? So some of y'all are thinking, as I know some of you think in my classroom, does 5 deaths really equate to being a massacre, right? Depends on what definition of that you're using. Back in the day, a massacre could have been an event or an occurrence that was led by wanton disregard for life, right? Or cruel or unusual death or punishment. So you can see very early on, after this March 5th event, they're labeling it, calling it a bloody massacre to shape perceptions both in and outside of Boston, right? So early on, even before this March event, you had a local newspaper. It was called the Journal of the Times. The Journal of the Times was trying to present the way it reported the news in a very unbiased, neutral manner. Things and events were occurring. Conflict was happening between the soldiers and local Boston residents that was being reported in the media, the Boston of the Times, but they were presenting the information in a very nonsensical way, a very apparently on face value, very unbiased way, avoiding hyperbole, sensationalism, and the reporting accounts where there were possibly attempted rape involving redcoats and female Bostonian residents. physical or verbal altercations between the same parties or redcoats and other Bostonian residents. They're reporting it, and they're basically, whether they knew about it at that time or not, they're laying the groundwork for when you do have an event like the Boston Massacre or the Bloody Massacre. They can basically, they didn't say this, but they can basically say, we shouldn't be surprised. We've been reporting on this for weeks at a time. This, as this continued to go and propagate, how can you expect anything other than the Bloody Massacre, right? And so what is not untypical or uncommon, multiple eyewitnesses on March the 5th. So there's a lot of conflicting accounts as to what started it, what instigated it, and who was at fault. And if you've had U.S. History 1, whether it was me or Mr. Smith or Ms. Grisham or Ms. Ricks or whoever, 9 individuals are going to be on trial, right? Captain Preston, the officer of the day, and 8 additional soldiers. They're basically tried for murder. And without taking the guessing game out of it, who was basically their defense attorney, future second president John Adams, right? And so when this goes to court, there were about 200 eyewitness accounts, and a lot of those accounts and descriptions of what happened conflicted or were contradictory. 85 of those individuals get, not really subpoenaed, but they get called to testify in court, some on behalf of the prosecution, some on behalf of the defense side, right? So what led to this account? All right, was it because earlier in that day you had some younger aged Boston residents, like literally throwing sticks, throwing stones, because it's March in the north, throwing snowballs at these, genius move, throwing snowballs at people with guns, right? Were they taunting these soldiers who were on duty, on their watch or whatever? Other accounts thought that this was payback by some of these soldiers because of humiliation, similar results that happened earlier that day or previous days. You also had some people testify, a limited number of that 85 that testified in court, saying that they swore or thought that there were shots coming from a second-story nearby building, right? Actually, a 14-year-old was exiled or kicked out of Boston and punished because he testified saying that he saw or heard gunshots coming from a second-story building when he knew that not to be the truth. So 2 of those 9 soldiers, counting the captain, took reduced charges of manslaughter instead of murder. The other 7 are found not guilty or acquitted or whatever. And then the 14-year-old is punished, whipped, and kicked out of Boston for lying under oath, basically, is how that's part of that broke down. So let me change the page here. You also, not only are you labeling this as a bloody massacre, not only is the local newspaper, the Journal of the Times, trying to present an unbiased view as to the lead up to this event, but you also have images like on the screen here that shows it very one-sided, right? This is a very typical image of the Boston Massacre, where on the right side you've got the very armed, very hostile and aggressive redcoats, and on the left side you've got the very unarmed, very innocent, very sober and not intoxicated Boston residents. A lot of these residents coming and verbally harassing soldiers leading up to this were coming out of taverns and bars and may have been partially drunk or inebriated, all right? Which leads to you throwing snowballs at people with firearms and guns, right? And so y'all heard me say this if you were in my class this week or last. We've all heard of this guy who has a monumental role in warning the patriots that the British are coming, right? Paul Revere depicted or illustrated this picture and almost literally made a point of making it look one-sided, because this is going to spread throughout Boston, outside of Boston, into cities like Philadelphia and New York, and it's going to instigate increased animosity toward the British government in this sense of martial law. All right. So to skip ahead, I've kind of talked about the court case and all that. After the Boston Massacre, after the court case and all that, John Adams serves as the defense attorney, does a pretty good job, right? I'm going to leave some of that story out of it on why he did that, future president, why he does that. For the first several years, they're going to commemorate. There's that word again. They're going to commemorate the events that led to and the event of March the 5th, 1770. But over time, that commemoration starts to shift. It's not just about the loss of those 5 deaths and the additional wounded. It's about the role that the Boston Massacre played, that puzzle piece that it played in the broader eventual conflict, right? So they're pivoting from that message, not just about the 5 deaths and the additional wounded, but the role that it played. And that also leads to controversy. Some historians will talk about the effect that the Boston Massacre had as far as closing that gap of opportunity for future compromise between the colonists and their government. Other historians will say that outside of Boston, it was just really a local event. It didn't have a bigger impact on the broader potential for war. It depends on what historian you read about in terms of that. So here, before we move on to topic number 2, you see a very quick shift over a matter of years of how the same event, where the focus is directed and how it's talked about. That's the Boston Massacre from U.S. History 1. U.S. History 2, been a while since I've taught that one. All right, 1994. Now, I've never been, as far as I know, unless I was a kid. I don't remember. I don't think I've ever been to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. I've been to the Smithsonian, just the other history museum, but I don't think I've been to this one. But 1994, I'd have been about 10th grade or so. Y'all were just a thought at that point. But the Air and Space Museum was wanted to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And that, of course, includes a discussion of dropping the bombs, right? Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs, not once, but twice. So the curators and the historians affiliated with the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum wanted to present a broad perspective that led to a broad view, a broad perspective of what led to dropping the bombs to end the war and result in Japan's surrender, right, in 1945. So instead of giving this rose-colored red, white, and blue perspective where America's the good guys and whatever, they want to take a broader perspective or scope of view and include Japanese casualties, not just the immediate deaths, but those who were ongoing, had been exposed to radiation, those that eventually die as a consequence of that. They want to think about the morality of the decision. Not that this was supposed to be a biased presentation or exhibit, but they want to present the attendees, the people who paid their money and view this in recognition of ending World War II, the thought process that went into whether or not to drop this deadly weapon on a city with the aim to end the war. Now, there's 2 different ways you can think about that, right? These atomic weapons can show military might. And there's historians that say that part of Truman's decision to drop these bombs was to show your hand toward the Russians because they may be your next enemy down the road. Show them what you got, right? From the strong American perspective, the decision to drop the bomb, you know it's going to result in deaths. I mean, you know that. But if World War II continues to rock on, that's going to result in more American deaths and more casualties and more and more and more. So there's a lot that factored in on whether or not to do this. They want to bring that to light for these attendees, recognizing the 50th anniversary to the end of World War II. And at the end of the exhibit, this is the plane that dropped the first bomb, whether or not you've had U.S. History 2 or not. The Enola Gay, that was the one that dropped the first bomb. You would get to see parts, not the whole plane, but parts of the plane on your way out. But that's 1994. All right, they're going to kind of roll this out at the beginning of 1995, but word gets out about what the focus of this exhibit is going to be. And you get some interest groups and lobbyist groups and veterans groups who do not like this. And this is not a point to make fun of the American Legion, or another group that was highly vocal against this was the the Air Force Association. They did not want this type of a broader perspective presented where it takes away from the idea or the image of the good war that the greatest generation participated in, right? And so to skip ahead, politics gets involved. Certain media commentators get involved, and they start throwing around lingo or words or labels that we sometimes hear today. They started to say that, they didn't start to say, they said that these historians were hijacking history, right? They were rewriting history. This is historical revisionism. I'll come back to that term, revisionism, later toward the end of this. These views and this perspective is anti-American. you're highlighting or overemphasizing the Japanese casualties, not so much the saved lives that would have occurred in death if this war would have continued. And so you had, I'm not familiar with this guy, all right, but at the time there was a member of the House of Representatives, Sam Johnson. He was from the state of Texas. I'm not familiar with him except for these quotes. There's some good ones. And Sam Johnson said, this is going to sound familiar based on the next topic I talk about. Sam Johnson said, in reference to what the curators and historians with the Smithsonian were doing, wanting to present, we've got to get patriotism back in the Smithsonian, right? We've got to focus on American ideals, values. Quote, we've got to get patriotism back to the Smithsonian. And he doesn't stop there. He says, Representative Johnson says, we want the Smithsonian to reflect real America and not something that a historian dreamed up. All right. So what happens by the time January 1995 rolls around, they still have the exhibit. You can still see, you could have still seen the Enola Gay on your way out the door after you pay your $10 or whatever to see the exhibit, but it's a very watered down version. And so I'm sure you can't really see the text, especially if you're in the back, but this is a common trend or an idea. If what we present has to be based on compromise or agreement as to what we view the facts to be, there's not going to be a whole lot to that exhibit, right? If you're only focused on what we can agree on and leave everything out that may be viewed as controversial, there's probably more cut out on the editing floor than what's actually included. And that's kind of within the context of the Enola Gay in this exhibit. That's what that cartoon behind me is focused on, but that applies to today as well, right? Because probably that essence is actually even more apparent, that we cannot compromise or get along. And if I don't agree with you on any given topic, whether it's the end of World War II or gun control or whatever, then I'm just not going to listen to you. Your words don't matter. So how you communicate something or how something is communicated to you can perceive or affect the way you perceive those events. All right. So here's the big one. All right. Here's my opportunity to say, as I say in government class a lot, this is not a political stance. I have a voting record that shows I will vote for conservatives and liberals. I have viewpoints, political stances on issues that are both conservative and liberal. So this is not my attempt to hate on any governor or state legislature, and this is not just a Mississippi thing. We're one of at least 14 states actively trying to regulate or ban the teaching of what is called critical race theory. Now I'm going to ask this, here's the interaction part. I know there's some people in here, probably at least one or two, that know more about critical race theory than I do. I'm not going to stand up here and act like I'm an expert about some CRT, critical race theory. This is an important issue, and I don't even really have a stance on whether critical race theory should be taught in education. I'm going to clarify that toward the end with some supporting material, whatever. I don't have a strong stance on this one topic. What I do have an issue with, doesn't matter who has the majority in the state legislature or what party the governor is or what state it is, when you try to regulate, restrict, or ban the teaching of something, when you give your supporting rationale, it needs to be based on fact and what the truth is. All right. So the question, what is critical race theory? Can somebody tell me? There's two ways to answer that. You can say the truth, right? What is critical race theory? It's a framework based on X, Y, and Z. Or how is it being communicated? How have you heard or seen through whatever news outlets or your grandfather or whatever? What is critical race theory? That's the 2022 classroom right there. Crickets. All right. Anybody? Critical race theory is often, especially in these states that are trying to ban it or restrict how it's taught, it's communicated in a way as if you're trying to not pick a side, but depict one racial group as being either inferior or superior than the other, and that some groups, whites, are inherently racist. And if you don't know that you're racist, then that in itself is racist, right? Sometimes that is how it's communicated in some circles. Critical race theory, not that I'm an expert on it, it's a framework. One reason I'm not so concerned about it in the K through 12 level, CRT is over the heads of our students. And if we're honest, I'm making half of a joke on this. If CRT is not included in mandatory state testing, it's not going to be taught. All right. So it's a framework that shows the intersection between race and American institutions, right? So that could be criminal justice reform, the education system, that could be housing or zoning policies, how race, the intersection between race and how racial groups are affected differently depending on the institutions or laws, regulations that affect them. That's critical race theory, not the one group is racist, how can we fix that? Right? And so the problem, to kind of backtrack or go back to what I said earlier, the issue that I'm concerned about is not whether or not we ban it or allow it, but base your arguments on fact, not just hyperbole, sensationalism, scare tactic stuff. All right? This is not the first time our state has seen controversial dialogue take place into what can be included in the classroom, because we've seen that even with the dang textbook. All right, it says it word for word. How controversial can a textbook be? Typically, whether it's a history textbook or a biology textbook or a math textbook, you would think that's about as clear-cut, straightforward, based on fact as you could imagine, right? It depends, all right? It depends on the perspective that the authors of that textbook, especially a history one, depends on the perspective or the scope that they view history in, your state's history in. So these two individuals, you can't really see it at the bottom, these two individuals, I may be butchering this first guy's name, Lowen, I think that's how you say it, Lowen and Salas. Salas was actually from Itawamba County, so he's kind of a local guy. The other individual, the other dude was from up north, had more of a sociological background, whereas Salas had a more historical, history-based background. They saw a need to write a modern, updated version. Now, this is 1970s. This starts in 1972 with this court, 1974, where this court case starts. In the early 70s, they saw a need for an updated, modern state history textbook. They had problems with authors of previous contemporary textbooks about glazing over certain issues, a lot of that being focused on race. All right, they thought that a lot of history textbooks teaching our state's history were glazing over, kind of underplaying the role of the Klan after the Civil War, or in the early 1920s, 1900s. After the Civil War, during the era of Reconstruction, they kind of downplayed that. So it was under the opinion of Lowen and Salas, these two individuals, that these textbooks were trying to propagate the idea that change, societal change over time, has somehow been a result of general consensus, where the majority has agreed on changes that need to take place, whereas these people are writing a textbook, it's in the subname, the subtitle, Conflict and Change. Change comes about through conflict, whether it's gender-related, racial-related, poverty or social class, economic class related. Change can result through conflict, maybe not necessarily strictly through consensus of the majority or by the majority. The problem was, I don't think we really have this type of a stage today in K through 12 type of textbooks. They do their work. It's not just them. This was like a whole group effort. They had student workers helping them do research and writing and editing, people from out of state presenting photos, sending photos. This was a group effort besides these two dudes, these two men, and they present their textbook before the Mississippi Textbook Purchasing Board. So if you were a public school, school district, or school to use tax dollars, state dollars, to purchase for your students a textbook, it had to be on the approval list. Guess what did not make the approval list, right? By a vote of 5-2, they shot down this book, largely because a lot of them thought it focused too much on race. One of these individuals, actually, I think he was one of them that voted in favor of the textbook. Anybody from Union County? Yeah, one of your guys voted for it. Right, and he was actually one of the few that had a history background. Some of these people had no background in history, yet they're grading the value of these various textbooks. They approved one. In 1974, they approved one textbook, and it was the same one they had been using before and approved prior. I guess it was just a different edition. They could have approved up to 3 or 5. It was more than one. They could have approved either 3 or 5. I had to go back and see, but they only approved one in 1974. This wasn't it. So they sue, they litigate. They think this is an undue process. When they asked in court, when they asked some of these individuals on the textbook purchasing board, why'd you vote against it? It was more than just race. There was one particular image, and I didn't show it in the presentation, but there was a lynching picture in the textbook. And so it was a black male being lynched or had been lynched. Come to find out, after the court case, this court case is not even decided until 1980. This rocks on for about a good 6 years, all right? After the case, they found out that wasn't even a picture that derived or came from Mississippi. It was one from Omaha, Nebraska, but they didn't know that until much later. Some teachers thought, some of these people on the board thought that this was going to create too much conflict or animosity between students within the same classroom by focusing more on race than what they were accustomed to. What was another good one? They thought that focusing on race and conflict was going to make you less proud of your state. Kind of that anti-patriotic idea, right? Let's focus on the good stuff, not so much the bad stuff. Which, if you think about it, from a societal standpoint, individual or societal standpoint, which one are you probably more likely to learn and advance and progress from? Your glittery good stuff, right, that you can bow your chest up about, or the mistakes you made, right? Which one has the most potential to elevate change? The argument by Lowen and Salas is, let's focus on the conflict and change. Pun not intended. So this goes to court in 1980. The judge, I don't know that at that time if he was a current resident of Boonville. He's from Boonville. So the judge who decides this case, he went by Hack Smith. Got no idea who he is, all right? His middle name, I think, was Reinhardt, which is a common name for some of these people around Tishomingo and Alcorn County. But Hack Smith from Boonville was the presiding judge over this case. Rules in favor of Lowen and Salas. Put the textbook on the option. They're not making the schools pick this textbook up. Make it an option that can be paid for through tax dollars, through your school district or whatever. You would think, let's make a movie out of this, right? Disney or Amazon should pick this up. Let's make a movie. They're fighting for the struggle. It gets put on the list and make $1 million. No, not that many school districts actually bought the book after the fact. This was a victory for free speech or academic freedom, not so much of a monetary gain for them. So there's kind of a sad story to that. To think more about this, I don't know how well y'all can see the Marshall Ramsey cartoon. If we don't fully understand what something like critical race theory is, and we're just listening to politicians, whether it's a politician in Texas, the state of Texas, or Arkansas, or Mississippi, or Idaho, if we're listening for their interpretation on how something is defined, explained, and why we should limit that, that ought to be a red flag, whether directed toward yourself or the people that may or may not be speaking the full story or the full truth about an issue. Okay, so let me see. Oh, my opinion on this. One reason I'm not so concerned about whether or not critical race theory is pushed through the education system, the state board, the State Department of Education has said there is no school district in the state, no public school district in the state that teaches currently critical race theory. Now, some people could say, well, our legislators or legislators in other states are doing this as a preemptive or a pre-actionary movement to keep it from. There's only one class that focuses on critical race theory. I read about this the other day in preparation for this. Mississippi Today reported there's only one class in the whole state that focuses on critical race theory, and that's a law class at the University of Mississippi. It's called Critical Race Theory Law 743. It's a law class. And I think I said this earlier, if we did implement this in 10th, 11th, or 12th grade to fully look at the framework of what it's supposed to focus on, this theory is supposed to focus on, it's going to be over the head of our students anyway. Thus, the only class in the state is a law graduate level class. So to kind of put a bow on this and put a wrap on this, it's the same definitions you've seen before. I'm refocusing our efforts toward how you talk about a certain issue can frame and shape the way we think about ourselves, the groups we're affiliated with, our state, our country, and how we progress or how we have progressed over time. So I've focused on 4 examples, maybe more so on one than I intended to, but I've given 4 examples, historic, 3 from a historic perspective, 1 from a contemporary modern example, and I try to present this in a somewhat comprehensive way. So in the future, whether or not somebody is trying to push one perspective or viewpoint on any given issue. It doesn't have to be CRT. It doesn't have to be the end or the morality behind ending World War II. It doesn't have to be the Boston Massacre. If somebody is trying to push one sole viewpoint on a given topic, it doesn't even have to be related to history, is their viewpoint based on fact, right? Is it based on fact or not so much? Is there more than one side to that event of what you're talking about? And from a historical standpoint or a sociological standpoint or whatever, if more than one person is involved, there's probably more than one side to that story, right? We probably learn more from considering the viewpoints and experiences of taking a more inclusive look and learn from that. Even if they're not reflective of us, what did the Japanese go through? Japanese or Japanese Americans, what did they go through World War II? What is the perspective of critical race theory and that intersection between racial groups and American governmental institutions? What are the various broader sides to that story or argument or whatever? Has new information been presented? That's your revisionism. Historical revisionism, I know how it's often depicted or thought about. Does not mean that it's a dirty word. Historical revisionism does not always have to be viewed as a negative, liberal reporting or account of anything. Revisionism is basically just when you re-envision or rethink or reevaluate something as new information becomes available or apparent, right? Sometimes when you have an outgoing president, you may not have access to all the presidential classified information until X amount of years after their presidency. After that is released, you can reevaluate the key events that happened during that president's tenure, during their administration, right? Revisionism does not mean or have to mean a negative thing. It doesn't have to have that negative connotation to it. And then if one group is adamant about just presenting, whether in the classroom or just talking about it in general, if one group of individuals is adamant about just presenting one viewpoint, you might want to question why. Why are they saying this? What are the other broader sides to that story or that account that they're trying to leave out, and what could be the potential reasons for that? So there's a lot, the original title for this is until I changed it this afternoon, it was going to be History is Not Rocket Science, but, right? Typically we think of history and teaching history as black and white, this is what happened and why. There's a lot of different sides to basically everything that you talk about in history. And having that and stepping back and not just focusing on the red, white, and blue shaded sunglasses view, considering the perspectives and experiences of others can help us learn and grow from that, whether it's through conflict or otherwise. These are the, I don't know how I did on time. How did I do on time? Y'all good? I'm working up a sweat here with this heavy jacket and the lights. So these are my sources. I think I've quoted or referred to the pictures by name. The articles came from news outlets or Mississippi Today. Those are the books that I used as the basis for the other key topics that I levitated or tended to stay on for a specific amount of time. So with that said, if anybody's got any questions, I may or may not can answer them. So anybody have anything? Didn't even look at my notes once. Didn't even take the paperclip off. All right.